Let me just express my thanks to all of those who have facilitated the floor staying open through the evening. We still have a ways to go, and I know that puts a lot of pressure on the staff here and all the folks who make this place operate, and I thank you for that. These are, in the minds of many of my constituents, very exceptional times, and they call for exceptional tactics and probably a few more exceptional moments on the floor of the Senate. And I appreciate everyone here staying through this long evening. Madam President, when I was a kid, I took an art class at a little one-room schoolhouse on Wells Road in my hometown where I grew up, of Wethersfield, Connecticut. And that little one-room schoolhouse is still there. It's iconic. It's a part of Wethersfield's history. The town's really proud of it. There's not a lot that happens in that one-room schoolhouse any longer, but once upon a time, there was a lot that happened in that one-room schoolhouse. That's where the kids of Wethersfield, Connecticut, the oldest town in the state of Connecticut, got their education. And, you know, wrapped up in the identity of this country is this association with those little one-room schoolhouses that were peppered throughout the landscape of New England and indeed across the country as our new nation progressed west. And it symbolizes this deep connection that this country has had with this very unique idea of public education. And I say that as a means of trying to explain to folks why we're here at 4:20 in the morning, why this nomination, the nomination of Betsy DeVos for Secretary of Education, has commanded this kind of exceptional attention. Why the switchboards here at the Capitol have been experiencing a volume never before seen in the history of this place. There's a special connection between our constituents and the idea of public education because it's rooted in some of the founding ideals of this country. Right? This country stands for the notion that you can come from anywhere, you can be of any background, and you will have a chance to make it here in the United States. And we didn't just say that, we lived that value. We built a society in which people could actually take that idea of succeeding despite any built-in impediments you may face, and we turned it into a reality. And public education from the very beginning of this country has been at the root of that uniquely American idea, the idea that you can succeed despite any barriers that may have been presented in front of you by circumstance or by birth. Now, public education at the outset was those one-room schoolhouses, everybody packed into one place, all sorts of ages and learning abilities, and one teacher, normally a female, at the front of the classroom. But over time, this country adapted. We learned from others. It was Horace Mann, the famous Massachusetts educator, that borrowed from ideas that he had found in Prussia and brought to the United States the idea of professionalization of public education, the professionalization of teachers, the sorting of students into grades, the idea that it wasn't just enough to put a whole bunch of kids into one classroom, that we needed to actually think through pedagogy, that we needed to put some time into making sure that there were high-quality teachers and instruction in all of our classrooms. And you can go around this country and find a lot of schools named after Horace Mann, because what we have today springs forth from many of his ideas, from his commitment to high-quality public education. And the system that he helped create is the one in which many of us grew up in. I went to public schools in Wethersfield, Connecticut. My mother went to public schools in Wethersfield, Connecticut. My father went to public schools in Wethersfield, Connecticut. They met in public schools in Wethersfield, Connecticut. My wife went to public schools in Fairfield, Connecticut. And my kids go to public school today. And so when I try to figure out why my office got 13,000 phone calls and emails with regard to this nomination, I think it's because public education is so deeply connected to who we feel we are as a country. We feel that we're the most powerful, most affluent nation on earth because of our unique commitment to public education. This idea that in order to succeed, you needed first to have access to learning, right? To the ability to read and to write, to do arithmetic, to be able to think creatively about science and the history of your country and your people. But also because public education is personal, right? When we talk about who we are, when we all think about our own personal biographies, it starts with where we went to school. Now, not everybody went to public school, but the vast majority of people in this country went to public school. And, when you think about who you are today, almost everybody's story runs through a great public school teacher. Right, the things that you learn that make you who you are today, yeah, certainly they probably come first and foremost from your parents or whomever raised you. But boy, you learn an awful lot about how to relate to people, about values. You make mistakes, you correct for those mistakes in school, whether it be in the classroom or out on the playground. For me, it was my 5th grade teacher, Miss Evaniski, who instilled in me a love of learning, but also a discipline about how to learn. I don't know that teachers would do this today, but Miss Evaniski had a list of all the assignments each week on the chalkboard and had our initials next to each one we had completed. There were 20 or 30 each week, and she'd just erase your initials and move it to the next one. Probably was a little bit too much of an exercise in public shaming for the kids that fell behind, but boy, there was accountability because every day you walked in, you saw whether you were keeping up with the assignments that week or you were falling behind. There was a rigor to it that attracted me, made me a better learner. It was 2 male teachers that I had in high school and middle school, Mr. Hansen, my 8th grade social studies teacher, and Mr. Peters, my junior year American history teacher, that got me thinking about government and the effect that it had on my life and the life of people around me. My family, I don't have a history in politics or public service. My love of public service, my interest in government comes from teachers that inspired me to care about the role that people played in our common history. And so when I think about why I'm here today, I think about teachers. I think first and foremost about my parents, but I think about teachers, and so do millions of other people around the country. Our common experiences are rooted in our public schools. And of course, it's still personal today for millions and millions of folks in my state and across the country because they have their kids, as I do, in public school, and they're seeing the great benefit that comes to their kids, the growth that happens in our public schools, and the continued learning that happens for educators. Public education is different today than it was when I went. We've learned things, right, that we don't have to, that we can't just focus on teaching basic skills like reading, writing, and arithmetic, but today we need to teach other skills like social and emotional skills. We're getting better all the time at public education, and it's why people are so proud of it. And so when presented with a nominee for the Department of Education, who says that public education is a, quote, dead end for students in this country, people take it personally, right? It feels different than when they listen to the nominee for Secretary of Treasury talk about banks, or when they hear the Secretary of Health and Human Services nominees for those positions, for that position, talking about health insurance. When you say that public schools are a dead end, and then, as Ms. DeVos has spent her entire career trying to empty out public schools and put kids into private schools, it hurts. It hurts because, well, we all know that public schools can be better, and we all have our critiques of the public education that we got or the public education that our kids have gotten. We know that it's not a dead end. Public education wasn't a dead end for me. I get to be a United States Senator because of the public education I got. It wasn't a dead end for my mother, who grew up in the housing projects of New Britain, Connecticut, but because of public schools that challenged her, even as a very poor little girl growing up in New Britain, she got to be the first woman in her family to go to college. It wasn't a dead end for my father, who went to public schools and ended up running one of the biggest companies in Hartford, Connecticut. And I hope it won't be a dead end for my kids, who are getting smarter and smarter every single day that they go to public schools. Public schools aren't a dead end. They can always get better, but to have someone in the Department of Education who doesn't believe in the way that most public school parents, most public school products believe in public education, it's offensive. And it's why our offices have received this unprecedented volume of correspondence. I represent a pretty small state, Connecticut, right? Isn't that big? But I got 13,000 letters and emails opposing Ms. DeVos's nomination. In a short period of time, right? She was only nominated a couple months ago. I don't know that there's any other subject in the entire time that I've been in government in which I received more correspondence over a short period of time like that. 13,000 pieces of correspondence, and almost all of them are in opposition to her. I mean, that's the other exceptional thing. There have been a few people that have called that support her nomination, but almost without exception, people are calling in to my office and to Republican offices, telling us that she is not the right fit. I'm writing to you as the mother of 2 children in kindergarten and first grade. My son is 5 and is autistic. I watched the recent nomination hearing on Betsy DeVos, and I am left sick to my stomach. I implore you to not support her for Secretary of Education. I'm beyond worried what this might mean for our school systems, in particular what this would mean for education, for the education and development of my son. We fight every single day for my son. We work for the services he needs. I spent 2 hours on the phone yesterday with health insurance companies trying to get his occupational therapy covered. With Betsy DeVos in charge of the public schools, I can't even imagine the roadblocks we would face. As a parent, all I want is for my son to grow and develop and thrive like any other child. It's hard enough doing this with disabilities, knowing our president openly mocks those with disabilities. Please, please, please do not support this nominee. I fear for my son. Another piece of correspondence from a college student from Old Lyme, Connecticut. I strongly urge you to oppose Secretary of Education nominee Betsy DeVos, whose confirmation hearing proved that she lacks both the experience and qualifications to lead the Department of Education. Mrs. DeVos has had no experience in public schools, not as a student, an educator, an administrator, or even a parent. Further, she admittedly has no experience with higher education or student loans. I'm a student about to earn my undergraduate college degree this spring. I highly suspect Mrs. DeVos has no interest in repairing or mending me or my fellow students' colossal debt problems, nor does she have the intent to alleviate the strain of other costs on parents and guardians. I might read some more of these letters, but they're sort of endless. And they speak to a real worry that people in my state have about Mrs. DeVos's commitment to public education. And so let me talk a little bit about why they're concerned. They're right to point out that this nominee has really no personal experience in our public school system. She didn't go to public schools. Her kids didn't go to public schools. She wasn't a public school educator. But that's not disqualifying in and of itself. I mean, all of us work on policy in which we don't have personal experience. It's the fact that she has spent her entire career and much of her family's enormous fortune trying to undermine public education that is so concerning. Mrs. DeVos, as has been repeated over and over on this floor, is a big fan, perhaps the biggest fan in the country, of vouchers, which is a means of giving students a handful of money so that they can go to a private school or a non-public school. And in theory, there's some attraction to this idea that you should be able to take that amount of money that we generally allocate to your education and bring it to a school of your choice. But in practice, vouchers are a disaster for our kids. Why? Well, first and foremost, it's because contrary to what Betsy DeVos and her family believe, the free market doesn't work the same for education as it does for the breakfast cereal industry. Right? Kids are not free actors in the way that other consumers are. And so what happens is that the parents and the families who have the means and the income to go find and afford a private school do so. They take that voucher and they bring it into the private sector, and the kids and the families that don't have the means to do that get left behind in underperforming schools. And the imperative to fix those underperforming schools gradually disappears. What happens with vouchers over time? Well, vouchers are never going to equal the amount of money that it costs to send a student to most private schools. It may cover the cost of the cheapest private schools, but families of means take those vouchers, supplement it with money that they already have, and send their kids to private schools. So vouchers end up just taking wealthier families and moving those kids into private schools while leaving behind kids who don't have parents who can supplement the amount of money in the voucher to allow their students to go to private schools. And so vouchers become a means of both economic and racial segregation. White families or families of higher economic means take the vouchers and they send their kids to private schools, and families with kids of lower economic means get left behind in lower performing public schools. Vouchers are a wonderful way to guarantee that you have very little mixing of kids of different backgrounds, races, or incomes. And that's what the evidence bears out. But vouchers have been used in even more insidious ways over the years. Think about what has happened to disabled kids. In many states, kids with disabilities will be offered a voucher to go to a private school that may have a basket of services that's more appropriate for them. But they have to make a deal with the school district in order to get that voucher. They have to renounce their legal rights to contest an appropriate education in order to get that voucher. Now, for many families, that voucher is a very shiny object. It looks like their salvation. But then when they get into that vouchered school, find out that they are in fact not getting the services that they thought they were going to get for their child, maybe because that school is being run by a for-profit company and they don't have that child's education in their best interest. They have profit motive as their driving imperative. The parent can't exercise their rights under federal law because they sign them away in order to get the voucher. In states like Florida, this happens tens of thousands of times over, where low-income disabled kids sign away their right to contest services that are guaranteed to them in order to get a voucher, only to find that when they get to that school, the services they were promised aren't there, and now they have no legal ability to try to get those services. The rug's pulled out from under them, they're left with no protection. And so vouchers have been used in terribly insidious ways to take from students and families rights that wealthier families that don't need to rely on the voucher would never sign away. And so it's not that Democrats oppose Mrs. DeVos's nomination because we don't like charter schools. And frankly, it's not because many of us don't support school choice. I don't have any problem with public school choice done right. I don't have any problem with charter schools. In fact, I have a long history of supporting high-quality charter schools. What we oppose is a voucher system that dramatically underfunds education and that requires students to lose or sign away their rights to get a quality education. And further, we oppose voucher systems that just end up taking public dollars and putting them in the hands of Wall Street. What is exceptional about Mrs. DeVos's experience in Michigan, what makes it different, frankly, than the experience of charter schools in Connecticut, is that in Michigan, charter schools are by and large run by for-profit companies. And let me tell you, the operators of for-profit charters, I'm sure, have the best interests of those kids in mind. But the investors in those for-profit charter schools have profit as their primary motivation. The people telling those administrators what to do have investor returns first on their mind and educational returns for the kids second. Because if they didn't, they would be a nonprofit charter school. If your primary mission was to run schools for the benefit of kids, you'd be a nonprofit. The reason that you set yourself up as a for-profit is so you can make money. I don't know why any school is operated on a for-profit basis. But in Michigan, 80% of charters are owned by for-profit operators. And we've seen what's happened in the higher education space. We've seen the frauds that are perpetuated on students because for-profit colleges have as their primary motivation making as much money as possible, not the education of kids. And so vouchers, underfunded, tied to the denial of rights for disabled kids, and established as a means of enrichment for investors in for-profit company are a terrible idea. But students and parents and teachers in Connecticut are concerned about Mrs. DeVos's nomination for other reasons as well. I wish that every minority kid and every disabled kid and every poor kid in this country got a fair shot, but that's not how education is played out. The federal government is involved in education for one primary reason, and that is civil rights. Right? The whole reason that the federal government got into the business of education is because children, primarily minority children, primarily black children, were being denied an equal education. And so in Brown v. Board of Education, it was held that separate education is unequal education, and in a series of civil rights acts following that decision, the federal government established laws to protect children and their parents from that kind of unjustifiable racist discrimination. And it happened in schools all over this country. Black kids were not given an equal education. And even after the schools were desegregated, states and municipalities found ways around the legal requirements to give an unequal education to minority kids. And here's a news flash for you. Racism hasn't vanished in this country. Discrimination has not been defeated. We're watching a president today pry on people's prejudices as a means of dividing this country to his benefit. And all across this country, you can see examples of sometimes intentional discrimination, other times unintentional, subconscious discrimination that continues to happen all over the United States. Like what happens in school discipline. If you are an African-American boy in this country and you goof off at school, you are twice as likely, right now, as we speak, you are twice as likely to be suspended or expelled than if a white student engages in the exact same behavior. Twice as likely. Disabled students all across this country are discriminated against. I'll give you an example from not so long ago in Texas. In Texas, an investigation by the Houston Chronicle discovered that the Texas Education Agency had arbitrarily decided that only 8.5% of students would get special education services, no matter if the school district had a higher percentage of kids with disabilities. The Texas Education Agency said that that only 8.5% of students in any particular school district could get special education services. And what happened? Kids all across the state who were disabled were denied the services that they needed. In Kentucky, just 2 years ago, an autistic 16-year-old named Brennan was severely injured, both his legs broken, when he was restrained at school. An investigation found that he suffered 2 broken femurs, a partially collapsed lung, and blood loss. He spent 8 days in an intensive care unit. An investigation found out that over the past 2 years, nearly 8,000 students in one county in Kentucky had been physically restrained, and 150 of them in this one county had been badly injured. That's just one example of what happens to disabled students all across this country. They get secluded and locked into chains and ropes, literally, as a means of trying to control their behavior. That doesn't work. That is by and large illegal. But it happens because still today, minority kids and disabled kids and poor kids, they don't have the political power that other school children have. Their parents might not be as loud as other parents are, and so they get intentionally and unintentionally discriminatory treatment. And so that's why at the federal level, we've had a history of requiring that states provide equal education to minority kids and disabled kids and poor kids. And that was a bipartisan commitment in the No Child Left Behind law. It continues to be a bipartisan commitment in the new elementary education law that we passed. Republicans and Democrats voted for a bill that holds schools accountable for equal outcomes, equal opportunity for every kid. Now, we dramatically amended that accountability requirement in the new law. We recognized that it probably didn't make sense for Washington to decide how you measure accountability and then how you intervene in schools that aren't getting results for those populations of vulnerable students. But we still required that every state have an accountability regime. Republicans and Democrats both voted for that. I sponsored the amendment with Senator Portman that put that accountability section into the bill. And another reason that parents and students in Connecticut are deeply worried about Mrs. DeVos's nomination is because she has a history of fighting accountability. In Michigan, she fought a state law that would have made all schools in that state, whether they be public, private, charter, traditional, accountable for their results. And when questioned before the Education Committee about her position on accountability by Senator Kaine, who just finished speaking, her answers were bizarre. Senator Kaine, will you insist upon equal accountability in any K-12 school or educational program that receives federal funding, whether it's public, public charter, or private? Okay, here's the easy answer to that question. Yes. I mean, that is not a gotcha question. I know folks have said that Democrats were trying to embarrass Mrs. DeVos in the hearing. That is an easy question. Will you support equal accountability in any K through 12 school that receives federal funding, public, public charter, or private? The answer to that question is yes. But she says, I support accountability. Okay, that's not as good, but maybe it's heading in the right direction. Equal accountability for all schools that receive federal funding, presses Senator Kaine. I support accountability, she says. Okay, Senator Kaine is sort of figuring out that this might be an evasion rather than an answer. He says, is that a yes or a no? I support accountability. Do you not want to answer my question, says Senator Kaine? I support accountability. Okay, let me ask you this. I think all schools that receive taxpayer funding should be equally accountable. Do you agree with me or not? Well, they're not today. Well, I think they should. Do you agree with me or not? Well, no. So at the end of that line of questioning, Senator Kaine finally gets his answer, which is that Betsy DeVos does not support equal accountability for public charter, or private schools. And of course, that's not surprising because she didn't support equal accountability when she was pushing for profit charter schools in Michigan. And Mr. President, that has devastating consequences for our children to have a Secretary of Education who is not going to require accountability for results in schools regardless of how they are established. And that has devastating consequences for poor kids and black kids and Hispanic kids and disabled kids who need in a Secretary of Education a champion for them. Not someone who advertises in her committee meeting that she is not going to fight for accountability in our schools. Frankly, I'm friends with some of the operators of charter schools in and around Connecticut. And in my experience, the supporters of charter schools have tended to be the loudest champions of accountability because for many charter school proponents, they go hand in hand. Accountability gives you sort of a clearer sense of the outcomes in public schools, which for charter school advocates tends to be an advertisement for an alternative way of education. And so charter schools, even those that are regularly critical of the public schools by Ms. DeVos, they normally argue for accountability, but not Betsy DeVos. She has a long career of opposing accountability. And if you look at an examination of the charter schools that she has supported, you can figure out why. Her charter schools aren't very good. If they had to be measured on equal footing with public schools in Michigan, the results would not be an advertisement for her or for her nomination to be Secretary of Education. In Michigan, they've set up a Byzantine system in which there's like 30 different regulators of charter schools, all with a confusing array of different ways that they measure performance. There's no way in Michigan to pull out data about how disabled students are doing on a school-by-school basis. They intentionally obfuscate the results of charter schools. Why? Because many of those associated with Ms. DeVos are not getting good results for their kids. That doesn't mean that charter schools can't get good results. Many of them can. But if you don't have accountability, if you don't require charter schools to prove that they're doing good for kids, then many of the bad ones will continue to provide low-quality results without any accountability. So many of the parents in my state are very concerned about Betsy DeVos when it comes to whether she is going to stick up for disabled students and low-income students. I asked her specifically whether she would keep on the books a regulation that was passed at the end of last year, which gives guidance for states on how they develop these accountability regimes for vulnerable populations. Again, this was an easy answer because everybody in the educational space supports this regulation. Superintendents, principals, teachers, parent groups, civil rights groups, groups representing the disabled. Frankly, it was a Herculean task for then Secretary John King to come up with an accountability framework that all those groups would support, but they all support it. And so I asked Ms. DeVos in the hearing, would she work to implement that regulation, or would she work to undermine it? And she gave me no answer. She certainly refused to commit to implement that regulation, which, by the way, is supported by everybody in the educational space. Undoing it would be a giant headache for everybody that works in education. Nobody wants it undone. And yet she would not commit it to keeping it in place. And then I asked her another super simple no-brainer when we submitted written questions. I just said, would you support the maintenance of the civil rights data collection system? This is like once every 2 years you have to report data on the performance of your minority kids in your state's schools. Once every 2 years you have to submit this report. And it's really important because it's one of the only ways that the Federal Office of Civil Rights, the Department of Education, can figure out if minority kids, black kids, Hispanic kids, Native Americans are getting a raw deal. She wouldn't even commit to maintain the data collection, never mind do anything with it. And so at some point, you got to figure out that where there's smoke, there's fire. She's been given all these opportunities to say, I'm going to be a champion for disabled kids. I'm going to stand up for minority kids. I'm going to make sure that every child, no matter their race, no matter their religion, no matter their learning ability, gets an equal education. And every time that she was given an opportunity to set the record straight, she obfuscated, she fudged, she clouded. When she got a question about the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act, she didn't seem to know what it was. So maybe that's why the answers were fuzzy when it came to protecting students with disabilities, because she didn't know what the law was. Maybe if she was asked specific questions about the accountability framework that demands results for minority kids, she would have given a similar answer because she might not have known what that was either. If you're going to be Secretary of Education, you need to have a moral commitment to protect these kids. But at the very least, you have to know what the federal laws are that provide those protections. Over and over again, she was given the chance to show that moral commitment. She did not. And in that hearing, she showed a troubling lack of knowledge about the statutes that protect those children. And the Secretary of Education, more than anybody else in this country, is responsible for delivering results for those kids. The federal government's not in education except for the cause of civil rights. Finally, Mr. President, I want to talk about what was, to me, maybe the most troubling answer that she gave in that hearing. So we had 5 minutes to question this witness. 5 minutes. I worked pretty hard to be a United States Senator. My constituents think this is a pretty important job. And I was given 5 minutes to ask questions of the next Secretary of the Department of Education, the person who is going to be in charge of the thousands upon thousands of public schools in this country. There is no precedent in this committee, the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, for senators being cut off, being denied questions when they have them. And we spent a lot of time in the committee hearing arguing over how much time we were going to get to question Ms. DeVos. And it became pretty apparent why Senator Alexander was restricting questioning as the hearing went on. This was a nominee who was simply not qualified. This was a nominee that was not ready for this hearing, who is not ready to be Secretary of Education. I had a wonderful meeting with Ms. DeVos. She's a nice person. But she's not qualified to be Secretary of Education. And Senator Alexander knew that. I mean, that's what I gather is that Senator Alexander sat down with her, figured out that she was not qualified, knew that she was not going to perform well, and came into that hearing with the specific intention of limiting our questions. Because as the hearing went on, it got worse and worse. I really wanted to ask questions about protecting disabled kids and low-income kids, and so I had planned to ask all my questions about whether she was prepared to stick up for those kids. And she gave very short answers to my questions that, as I said, didn't give me any confidence that she's going to stand up for those children. But when I looked down at my clock, I still had 30 seconds left. I only have 5 minutes, so I better use all of my time. And so I asked her what I thought was a no-brainer. I asked her whether she thought that guns should be in schools. Now, she probably should have known that that question was coming from me. I wasn't intending on asking it, but my public service is defined by what happened in Sandy Hook, Connecticut in December of 2012. And she knows she's going to work for a president who has promised to ban states and local districts' ability to keep guns out of schools. And so her answer, which has now been replayed on the internet 1 million times, was shocking. First, her inability just to plug in to the emotion of this issue. Right? The first thing you should say in response to that question is our number one obligation as education policy professionals is to keep kids safe. Right? Start there. Start with a commonality about our obligation to keep kids safe. But that's not where she started. She started by saying, "Oh, that's really up to the states and the local school districts." The reason she gave for that is, now infamous, that some schools in this country need to be protected against grizzly bear attacks, and it's probably unfair how much attention that response was given. She sort of came up with it on the spur of the moment. I don't suggest that it reflects her full thinking on the subject of guns in schools, but she then immediately contradicted her answer. Her first answer was that really should be up to states and local school districts. And so I asked her the next logical question. Well, if President Trump asked you to implement his proposal to ban local school districts and states' ability to decide for themselves as to whether they want guns in schools, would you support it? And she said, I'd support whatever he did, whatever he asked me to do. So on one hand, she says that it should be up to states and local school districts whether they have guns in the classroom. And on the other hand, she says that she will support a federal prohibition on gun-free school zones. You can't have it both ways. And much of the outpouring of opposition from Connecticut is due to the answer that she gave to that question. Parents in Sandy Hook, Connecticut can't understand how a Secretary of Education could think that putting guns in our school would make our schools safer. This idea that the right has, that the folks that the DeVos family hang around with have, that if you just load up our communities with guns, it'll guarantee that the good guys eventually shoot the bad guys, has no basis in evidence. Routinely, guns that the good guys have to protect against the bad guys get used to shoot the good guys. And even when guns are around, when bad stuff goes down, they don't get used to shoot the bad guys. Parents and teachers in this country are freaked out that we would have a Secretary of Education that would promote arming our schools. And though at the end of that short back and forth between Ms. DeVos and I, she did admit that kids getting killed in schools was a bad thing, suggesting that schools need to be armed in order to protect against wild animal attacks doesn't suggest that that's on the top of your mind. How deeply offensive that answer was to families like those in Sandy Hook who have gone through these tragedies and know that the answer is not to arm principals and administrators and teachers with high-powered weapons so that they can engage in a shootout inside a school. Even that school in Wyoming that she referenced noted within 24 hours that they didn't feel like they needed a gun to protect against grizzly bears. They had a fence and they had bear spray, and that was good enough. I admit she's gotten probably a little bit too much grief for that particular answer. But it capped off her performance in that hearing that was disqualifying, that showed a lack of interest in protecting vulnerable kids, poor kids, black kids, Hispanic kids, disabled kids, showed a stunning unfamiliarity with the laws that govern education, demonstrated an enthusiasm for market-based principles in public education that simply don't work, showed a disregard for the danger of profit motivation driving decisions in education, and uncovered some incredibly dangerous positions that we had not previously known about, like her enthusiasm for putting guns in schools. That's why 13,000 people in my little state of Connecticut sent letters and emails, made phone calls in opposition to her nomination. I had a really nice meeting with Ms. DeVos in my office. I concede that she could have spent her money and her time, she had a lot of money, on something other than trying to make schools better. And so I give her credit. I give her a lot of credit for the fact that she spent her fortune, much of it, and a lot of time into making kids' education better. But that's not a qualification alone. Being rich and spending your money for a good cause doesn't automatically qualify you to be in the cabinet. Despite those good intentions, over and over again, Mrs. DeVos has shown that she is willing, with her time and her money and with her advocacy, to make good on her belief that public schools are a dead end. To empty out our public schools of money and students, to use taxpayer funds to enrich for-profit investors, and to leave behind millions and millions of vulnerable kids who need a champion in the Department of Education. Public schools were not a dead end for me. Public schools were not a dead end for my parents. Public schools were not a dead end for my wife. And I'm sure, having only watched my kids progress through second grade and pre-K, that public schools will not be a dead end for my children. But to have a Secretary of Education who doesn't believe that the public schools that are going to be under her charge can lead to results for our kids like they have for generations is unacceptable. And it's why this body, in a bipartisan way, should rise up and say no to her nomination and ask this president to appoint someone who is going to be a daily champion of our public schools, not use the Department of Education to undermine them. I yield the floor.